Shabbat Shalom. Nostalgia is a funny thing. For most people, if they are to ask, what was the golden age? What time would you love for the country, the world to return to? Inadvertently, most people will pick the decades when they were a kid. It's not exactly surprising. If I were to go back to the 1970s, I'm not imagining the 1970s with the Cold War at its height. I'm not imagining the 1970s with the Iranian Revolution, with the Yom Kippur War. I'm not imagining the 1970s as being fuel shortages, energy crisis, and all those other problems, hyperinflation on top. I'm imagining the 1970s as playing in the field near my house. I'm imagining the 1970s hanging out with friends at school. And that gives it a little bit of a nicer glow. Nostalgia is tricky that way. We have a hard time reflecting on the past, even when we were there, because the person we are now is not the person who was there. And if I were to go back to the 1970s as an adult, I am pretty sure I would not find it nearly as satisfying as I find the 21st century. The 2020s, with all of its problems, in most ways, is far preferable to the 1970s. However, we are a backwards-looking people. I don't mean that as a pejorative. I mean we look to the past. We are a nation of history. We are a nation that believes that there have been amazing times in our past. But as you read through the Torah portion and the Haftarah today, hands up everybody who wants to go back to the time of Sarat. Anybody interested in going back, where we're putting the blood on the ear and the toe and the thumb? No, I'm not getting a lot of takers here. Okay, well, let's go back to a more general description of society and see, were the people in the past barbarians, or were the people in the past actually living a righteous life that we would be good to emulate? Who here wants to go back to flogging? Makot, right? One of the most common forms of punishment mentioned throughout the Torah. Not getting a lot of hands. Maybe you're imagining that you might get a sore back. Who here wants to go back to executions for Shabbat violations? We can execute people if they violate Shabbat. Okay? Who here wants to go back to when we can take our suspected wife, who we suspected an adulteress, and drag her to Jerusalem for a publicly humiliating ceremony to establish once and for all whether she is cheating on her? Well, I get a couple hands on that one, but perhaps you're embarrassed to raise your hand. The problem with all three of those examples is, just as there's a danger of using nostalgia to romanticize the past, there is also the opposite of nostalgia, where we unrighteously criticize the past without truly understanding what was going on. This is one reason why Jewish study and Jewish study of Jewish law is so essential. So let us take these few examples and see whether or not, even if we're not going to be returning to the precise structure of what our ancestors lived, whether they were not quite so stupid and barbaric as that short description I gave you might have hinted at. So let's go back to the idea of the suspected adulteress, the sota ritual as it is known throughout Jewish law. Most people, when they read through the section of Bamidbar that describes the ceremony, immediately and erroneously come to the conclusion that indeed any husband can take his wife at any time to Jerusalem in order that she can be humiliated by his jealousy in some barbaric trial by drinking water. Nothing could be further from the truth. If you were with me in the Mishnah class when we studied Sota, or if you want to go to YouTube and catch up, you'll see that the Sota ritual was restrained extremely by the judicial procedures of the day. There were numerous safeguards to prevent a husband from accusing his wife without any evidence or without any witnessing to both the accusation and an actual act of wrongdoing on her part. It is not just enough for him to decide to fly into a tizzy one day and drag her off, but instead these things must be established very clearly. And the ritual itself, as our rabbis make clear, was designed more to facilitate a reconciliation than it was to embarrass or punish the woman herself. puts a different perspective on it. It was perhaps not as gentle as modern-day couples therapy, but then psychology as a modern discipline had not been invented. But it is clear that the halakha, the law, was not designed to punish any one person, but was to provide some avenue for a reconciliation within a relationship that saw no other means of reconciliation due to the errors, and they were considered errors on both sides. Execution. Right? We all love a good execution, right? Or we still statistically see a majority of people supporting capital punishment. So certainly we are all for the execution of the ancient world, which must have just been rampant, right? The people were probably being executed left, right, and center. They didn't have, 13 layers of appeals courts. They didn't have fancy lawyers in three-piece suits. The people must have been tried and executed on the same day. No, that was not how Judaism handles capital punishment. And we have long records of how we have, as well as the law describing how we should. Jewish law, in fact, puts massive barriers between the power of the state and the life of the individual. Judaism says that there needs to be special forms of witnessing, there has to be special types of warnings given to the perpetrator before they commit the crime at that moment, and there needs to be special judicial processing as well as additional evidentiary restrictions to ensure that this is given absolute, perfect handling before a life is taken. And even up to the very last minute when the person is about to be executed, which was done in a more humane way than stoning makes it sound, there is always the chance for an additional reprieve, to return to the court, to hear new evidence, to see whether or not indeed there was something wrong with that. Because no court wanted to ever execute a person without absolute certainty that it was the proper sentence. And in fact, in the modern world, if we were to apply the Jewish standards in the modern situation, 99% of all executions, at least, would not be considered kosher by Jewish law. Yes?
Wasn't one Sanhedrin or court called the bloody court because it brought back the decision and everyone was sent home? Think about it.
Well, no, there was always a delay between the decision and the execution.
Right.
But there was a nickname given that if a court sentenced people to be executed once every 7 or 70 years, depending upon the version, that such a court was considered a hanging judge. That was considered a bloody court. One execution out of multiple years for a nation was considered to be excessive. A different model, obviously, than what we have. So let's take the hardest one to defend. The one that probably sends chills down your spine, flogging. Most of us are extremely averse to corporal punishment, to the idea of taking a whip of leather and of lashing at someone's back because of a crime that they committed. And most of us simply cannot fathom the barbarism that would allow one person to treat another person that way. So for a moment, I want you to try and understand what were the alternatives 2,000, 3,000 years ago. A person has committed a crime which is not of a sufficient severity to warrant their execution. They have committed a crime that does not have any direct monetary compensation. They didn't damage something or harm another person for which they could be compensated financially. How do you punish them? Or do you not? And you just say, oh, look, someone just did something that was wrong. Shrug. Put them in jail, right? That's what we decided to do in the United States. Throw them in prison, give lengths of times of loss of freedom as the means of taking care of them. Was there the physical possibility of sustaining a prison population in the ancient world? No. People were barely able to make ends meet when every family was working to grab food out of the dirt, called farming. And the idea that you could take people and put them away for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years and continue to feed them and continue to house them and take care of all the people who are taking care of them without them being involved in the production of more foodstuffs is simply inconceivable. Prison was not an option. Plus, prison was considered to be barbaric. The idea that the best form of punishment was to take a person out of society, to ruin their life for decades at a time, to isolate them from their fellows, to deprive them of all the aspects that make a person human. Well, that is considered abhorrent to our ancestors. And indeed, in the modern world, there's not a lot going for the idea of length of time of incarceration as being a proper form of punishment either. Now, proper time for rehabilitation, that's a slightly different issue. But as a form of punishment itself, there's not a lot of more humanity to simply isolating a person than there is to whipping them and putting them back into society within their family, within their community, the very next day, allowing them to get on with their life and to improve. Remembering that in Jewish law, flogging was not a simple, hardcore brutal act. Yes, it wasn't pleasant, but there were estimates that were to ensure that a person would be able to sustain the flogging that occurred, that a person would not die under the lash. And in fact, were a person who was doing the flogging, if an official of the court were to even barely trespass over what had been prescribed and the person did die, then the person who was the official of the court would be considered a murderer for having killed that person, since that was not the appropriate punishment. Now, I'm not actually advocating for a return to flogging. I think we can do better than that. Although I think we need to remember that we need to do better than that, and I'm not 100% sure we're doing a whole lot better at the moment. But instead, I want you to simply reflect on these three as well as the rest of the range of Jewish life in the ancient world, and recognize that although some of the details may seem odd to us, as odd as the Tzaraat conditions described in the Torah reading and the Haftorah, but the principles remain the same. One of the great advantages of flogging, I know it sounds like a strange phrase, is that the powerful cannot have a different punishment than the powerless. If you are a powerful person and violate a law for which the punishment is flogging, you too will be taken to the town square, you too will have your shirt torn open, you too will have your back whipped. Whether you are a rich person or a poor person, you cannot buy your way out of the punishment. There is no additional money you can give to the judge to have the flogging canceled. You and everyone else will have the same punishment. It was proportional. The crime you committed is the crime for which you are punished, not balanced based upon your status or the esteem that you were held in the community, not tainted by any other considerations of race or gender or religion. There was one law for all people. And indeed, both with the laws of Sota as well as the law of capital punishment in general, the principles of Rodev Shalom, to seek peace, and Rodev Tzedek, to seek justice, were at the heart of everything our community stood for. It was not perfect by any imagination, and I do not want to sound like I am nostalgic for the ancient world. I think we have done better, and we can continue to do better still. But we need to recognize in the actions of them that what they were pursuing, peace, justice, and a single law that applies to all, are standards that we must also work diligently to provide. We must make sure that we are as passionate about them within our massive communities of millions as they were in their communities of hundreds. The principle of justice is something that does not get lost in the anonymity of a large society. The principles of peace and reconciliation does not get lost just because we have grown larger. And the principle of appropriate punishment is something that must be maintained regardless of the scale of society. Shabbat Shalom. We continue now with our